figure that as a Korean national, as well as a person who knows a lot about Korea, it's kind of like my obligation. Okay. So it's kind of like my obligation to talk about Korea. So here it is. I'm first going to give you an overview of Korean history, or rather modern Korean history. Then move on to talk about unification, about North Korea, and the part about Korea that you are probably interested in. So I'd like to first begin with the question, what is Korea? So if you look at the map that I've given you, you can kind of get a sense of where it is. It's between superpowers. It's between China, Japan, and Russia. Three countries which have always been, in relative terms, stronger than Korea. So for us, it was always an issue of how we survived. It was always an issue of how Korea could remain important, despite being surrounded by such large countries. So it's important to, when you consider Korea, to acknowledge that Korea is surrounded by these gigantic states. Korea, and the Koreans claim that they have 5,000 years of history. That they say that it starts in BC 2333. It's disputable, but I can tell you that we have at least 3,000 years of history. There's a lot of Chinese influence, and a lot of people wonder why we can write Chinese characters. It's because we didn't have our own alphabet until the 15th century. One of our kings decided that we needed to have a Korean way of writing down things. So we have a Korean way of putting it. We call it the Hangul. It's a Korean characters. But we also use the Chinese characters to differentiate between the different meanings. Because in Korean characters, even if it's written in the same way, it can have different meanings. Because a lot of the words originate from the time before the 15th century. So having established that, let's move on to how Korea, Japan, and China differ. A lot of kids have asked me this, what's the difference between the Koreans, Chinese, and the Japanese? First of all, they look different, or you can say that they look different. But also, there are similarities. There's Confucian influence. Also, we use chopsticks, but that's about it. Anything else? Everything else? Different. Okay? The language is different. The Japanese have their own way of writing things, the Koreans have their own way, and the Chinese, of course, have Chinese characters. But more than that, our history differs significantly. Our culture, our eating habits, what we eat, our cuisine, it's all very, very different. And so let's jump all the way to Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945, because that's when this Korean identity was first created. This Japanese occupation played a major role in creating what we call the Korean identity and the concept of the Korean people. Because Korea was really divided and then united and then divided again. And this whole concept of what it means to be Korean was created during the Japanese occupation. Probably, I think, as a way of getting the Koreans to fight against the Japanese. It's easier for the Koreans to fight back if they unite. So this whole concept that we're so proud to be Koreans, that was created during the Japanese. And this whole pride in our own language, in our own characters, in our own 5,000 years of history, that was created during the Japanese occupation. And yeah, because the Japanese, they made all sorts of attempts to get rid of this Korean identity. They wanted the Koreans to be incorporated into the Japanese empire. That failed miserably because the Koreans, well, they tried all the time to make sure that people knew what it meant to be Korean. And they emphasized such differences. They emphasized these unique traits that set them apart. So now let's move on to the Korean War in the present day. A lot of you, surprisingly, know about Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee. Syngman Rhee was the first president of the Republic of Korea. He was educated in the United States before 1910, so that's really one of the first Koreans to study abroad. He was educated at George Washington University, and he got his master's and his PhD at Harvard and Princeton. And he came back and became a dictator, just so you know. And then he stayed in power until 1960, where there was massive student uprising against corruption. And during Syngman Rhee's regime, unlike what Ali may seem to suggest, I wouldn't say there was massive development taking place. I would say he wasn't really a kleptocrat because he didn't take much when he fled to Hawaii, but he wasn't really a successful leader. What he did was establish very strong ties with the United States, possibly because of his very pro-American background, but that's just about all he did. He established the military, he established different departments and a lot of ministries of different branches, but that's about it. There wasn't really economic development taking place until we get to Park Chung-hee. Park Chung-hee ruled Korea for about 17 years, between 1963 and 1979. He rose to power in the coup d'etat. He was only a 1- or 2-star general before he came to power. And he came up with this brilliant idea of having 5-year development plans. And these ideas he stole from the previous administration, which is a democratically elected system, a government, following the parliamentary way of doing things. And these 5-year development plans are very similar to those proposed by Joseph Stalin. And he also adopted a very Japanese-like way of supporting tycoons, or a small number of major companies, so they could rise and lead the South Korean economy. And that did take place. The companies that you know of, when I ask you about what's a South Korean company, like Samsung or LG or Hyundai, they're all these chaebars or tycoons that Park Chung-hee himself chose personally to raise and give government subsidies to. And our economy is very export-oriented for a very good reason. It's because we don't have enough people living in our country. We have to be export-oriented. Otherwise, we can't really reach economic progress. And so we reached $10 billion of exports by 1977. And Park Chung-hee did all sorts of things, like sending over 300,000 troops to Vietnam to fight there for the U.S., sending a lot of nurses and miners to West Germany so that we could get a lot of money from that, sending workers to work in the sun, under the hot sun of the Middle East. We got a lot of money from the Shah of Iran as well. And all of these funds were used for the economic development of the Republic of Korea. And he kind of succeeded. And as you can see from the graph that I presented you on your right about the South Korean flag, that shows the growth in South Korean GDP. So it kind of shows how market of economic development my country went through. And then that was followed, because he was assassinated in 1979 by his own KCIA director. So let me move on to, a lot of military dictators. And these people just continued on the policies of Park Chung-hee. And so we reached a level so that by 1980, no one in South Korea was really starving. That was the case in 1950, because during the Korean War and afterwards, South Korea virtually had nothing. We don't have any natural resources. All we have is manpower. And so with Park Chung-hee, we can see there's a start of what we call the miracle of the Han River. That's a river that goes through Seoul, the nation's capital. And it's kind of like the miracle of the Rhine. It's because we say that we started from nothing, and now we have one of the world's largest economies. We're 11th in the world. And considering that South Korea had nothing in 1950, we say, at least I say, and I think that's why the South Koreans are so proud of their country, because we started off from nothing. Now let's move on to Korea, which is about now. So after these military dictators, around 1987, South Korea underwent democratization. It's mostly led by student protests and student riots. My own parents were part of that. Over 1 million students rose up against the government. The government was always elected, technically speaking. And in many elections, especially when it came to the National Assembly, in many cases, the opposition party did take control. And they actually acted to put pressure on the administration to actually make democratization possible. So anyway, we have now, it's our 4th democratically elected president in power. And so we move on to talk about North Korea. Is North Korea really a global threat? Because I don't know. Some say they have nuclear weapons, others say they don't. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. South Korean experts tend to believe that they do, but they simply don't have the missile technology to shoot it all the way to the United States. Others say they simply don't have the nuclear technology. They say it's close, but not quite there. The thing is, well, it's a mystery. And we always talk about human rights abuses, about cannibalism, about prostitution, human trafficking. All of these things are taking place at a massive rate. It's taking place, it's incredible. The scale of all of these taking place, it's beyond belief. And the economic situation in North Korea, it's getting worse year by year, and mostly because the North Korean regime can't really have a self-sufficient economy. So what it really does is it strengthens its relationship with China and sells off its natural resources. Because North Korea, believe it or not, has a lot of natural resources, the potential value of which reach in the trillions and trillions of dollars. Lignite, $1 trillion. Limestone, another $1 trillion. Gold and silver, copper, all of these in the billions of dollars. And they're simply selling it off to China. Kim Jong-il is getting that. He's distributing it to his cronies so that he can stay in power. And until now, that has proven to be quite successful. Now, when we move on to the other side, we see there's the direct U.S. military presence. About 25,000 troops are stationed across Korea, 25,000 U.S. troops. The South Korean military numbers in 650,000, which is the 6th largest in the world. And these, well, the U.S. military and the South Korean military together, they're acting as a deterrent to prevent really full-scale war. Until now, it has proven to be successful. We won't know in the future. Well, I'd like to move on to talk about split families and refugees, because over 20,000 people over 20,000 refugees have successfully fled from North Korea and entered the Republic of Korea. The number is rising every year. You look at that graph, but some has things written in Korean. That shows you the number of people entering South Korea who used to be North Korean citizens. And so we see the number of refugees rising, but it's not quite significant enough to say that the regime in North Korea is collapsing. But it's pretty much a good indicator of how harsh the conditions are in North Korea. Now let's talk about this concept of the split family. We estimate that between 100,000 and 10 million people can be classified as being part of the split family. It's really a vague estimate because it really depends on how you define this concept of the split family. If you know someone who's missing, does that mean that you're part of that split family group? Well, does that mean you're not? Well, that really depends on the definition. The split family is someone who's a family that's split, either because of the Korean War or because of various other reasons, because North Koreans used to kidnap a lot of prominent South Korean people, or non-prominent people too. They kidnapped a lot of people. And so that's a major reason that people push for this concept of unification, which is something that I'm going to be talking about later on, or rather, right now. Let's talk about unification. The South Korean government from 1998 to 2008 has pushed forward a policy called what they call a sunshine policy. It's pretty much an engagement policy. It's saying, we'll give you this, and you will give us back this in return. It's like, we'll give us a lot of economic assistance, and we expect your cooperation. And we push for economic partnership, cultural exchange programs. And South Koreans say that was complete failure. I would like to say it's not really complete failure, because we only tried it for a decade, and maybe you needed to give it a bit more time. The fact of the matter is it didn't really help right now. Because right now what we have is a government, a South Korean government, which is pushing for a hardline policy, or a hardline stance, towards the North Korean regime. And so that's why you see all these kind of military clashes taking place. I think there was a Yongkang shellings and the Cheonan incident. Well, all the headlines going about Korea, the possibility of war. That's mostly because our president doesn't want to succumb to the will of the North Korean regime. It's not working very well, and we're nowhere near unification. But nonetheless, South Koreans and Koreans in general always talk about this concept of unification. Because we're only, I think, maybe you're the only country, and we were until 1990 one of the only countries that were divided. And the thing is, it's not simply a question of do you want to unify, it's also a question of can you unify? Will other countries let you unify? Will the United States like to see a united Korean peninsula? Will the Chinese like to see a united Korean peninsula? Will the South Korean public like to see a united Korean peninsula? And these questions all have to be addressed for you to gain a really good idea of what this whole thing means. Because believe it or not, Koreans are losing their support for this whole concept. Because on a very practical level, it costs a lot. And with this facts and figures, it's all about unification. The direct aid given to North Korea from the South Korean regime, the South Korean government during the era of the Sunshine Policy was a few $1 billion. It didn't really help very much. But now, moving on to talk about unification, you see that even when we compare it to the case of the two Germanys, the scale is just beyond comparison. The estimated unification cost of the two Koreas is between $2 and $3 trillion. And that's several times the GDP of my country. Which means that for the citizens living in South Korea, if they were to vote on that, many of them are now willing to say no. Because unification would mean that my quality of life would decline dramatically. Social welfare would be cut automatically. Because we need a lot of money simply to maintain law and order in North Korea, where we unify. And if you compare it to, and some people say the amount of money you can save by the reduction in military expenses is significant. But as you can see, it's only $15 billion per year. If you add that up for, I don't know, a century, maybe you'll get how much money you need for unification. But we're not getting there. So in Korea, we have talks going on about unification pacts, about having enough money to unify. But the thing is, the public support is going down every single year. So what I see is that when I was born, it was like 70%. Now it's more like 50-something%. When I asked my fellow students in my school, in my high school, it was more like 49-point-something%. So were we to have a referendum in 20 years' time, in 30 years' time, will the South Korean public vote yes? Possibly not. And then what happens if the North Korean regime collapses? No one knows. And the thing is, the Chinese don't really want a unified Korea under the hands of the South Korean government. The United States, of course, would like to support the united Korea, possibly. But are they willing to finance, or are they willing to take part in this process? Probably not. Because you guys, or the Americans in general, or the American government, has a lot of national debt. And you guys can't possibly, or the American government, let's say, cannot possibly finance this. And so it becomes a really tricky question. I want unification because I feel that, well, that's how things are supposed to be. We were united for thousands of years, we need to be united again. But do we have the money? West Germany was the second largest economic power at the time. East Germany was the best performing economy in the communist bloc. Now we're not the best performing economy in the Western world, we're like 11. I look at North Korea, it's like the worst economy in the world, right? And then you compare the population. South Korea has a population only double that of North Korea. West Germany had 4 times the population. They could really incorporate East Germans. If you compare the level of interaction and cultural exchanges that were taking place prior to German unification, they had exchange programs taking place for decades. East Germans could see West German television. They could watch West German news before unification. If you go to North Korea and you're caught with a South Korean DVD, you're executed. So it really shows how much of a difference there is between South Korea and North Korea and the concept of unification in Korea and the concept of unification in West and East Germany. So if you're simply going to say, it was possible there, so it's going to be possible here, it doesn't really make sense. And it's a very intriguing question, because I want to be a politician. I want to be in public service. I want the two Koreas to unify. But can I persuade the population? Will the South Korean public really want this? And will the South Korean government be able to say yes and go for that? I don't know. Do they have the justification? Do they have the legitimacy behind pushing forward such a policy that would cost trillions of dollars? Maybe not. Okay, so I'm pretty much done with my PubSpeak, but I'd just like to get back to one point. This is going back to what Ali was talking about dictators, and because Korea had a lot of dictators, I'd like to just point that out. Possibly, dictators can help the people. But can we say dictators are the only people who can help the people? I say that's a tricky question as well. But there is one example in Korean history that clearly shows why dictatorships may be a lot more effective than democracies. During the reign of Park Chung-hee, no one thought that Korea would be able to industrialize. No one thought that Korea would be able to catch up with prominent states like the French or German. No one thought that the Koreans could be like that. But Park Chung-hee had a vision. And he had a vision that he was willing to push for. And so sometime he wanted to create a national expressway, a national highway. Korea didn't even have a highway system back in the 50s and back in the 60s. He wanted to construct a highway that would connect the 2 largest cities in the peninsula. 90-something%, I think it's 93%, of the representatives in the National Assembly said no. But Park Chung-hee issued an executive presidential decree and pushed for that. And thanks to that, the South Korean economy was, and we say that's one of the most important decisions that allowed the South Korean economy to develop. Because that allowed the industrial hub of the Republic of Korea, which is mostly in southern Korea, to connect with the nation's capital. That allowed trade, that allowed transportation to take place between the 2 major cities, and the cities in between prospered as well. And that would have been impossible under a democratic regime. Democratic regimes would have been swept by populism. They would have been swept by giving a bit more welfare for a short period of time. Park Chung-hee begged to differ. He was willing to provide subsidies to companies which were willing to work. Although he had visions that many people considered ludicrous, he was willing to push for that. And in that sense, you can say that dictators with visions are great people. Thank you.
Before we begin, I just want those people over there to sit in the chairs here. There's still space.
Yeah?
So, has there been like postulated like exactly how they would try to unify with North Korea?
Well, there are like various ways. North Koreans say they propose one state, 2 system policy. It's not really going to work. What most Koreans have in mind, what most South Koreans have in mind, is that we would absorb North Korea, just like West Germans did. But as I told you, it costs a lot of money. It costs $2 or $3 billion.
I forget the son's name, but Kim Jong-un maybe. What do you think he's going to be a more effective leader, or do you think that might lead to regime collapse, perhaps?
A more effective leader as in what
Like
sense?
Kim Jong Il's son, can he keep hold of his country? Is what I'm gonna say.
Well, the thing is, from what I've read from South Korean sources, from what I've read from the New York Times and stuff like that, what I think is that Kim Jong-un is different in many ways, but he's similar in a lot of other ways. He's kind of like his father. He doesn't want, I don't think he wants, like, an open door policy. He doesn't want democratization. He doesn't want that. He wants to stay in power. The North Korean regime realizes that it's not really a communist state. It's more like a one family, it's a Kim dynasty. And they realize that, and they're not really happy about it. And there are many signs that really show the population isn't happy about it. So I would say that that would lead to instability.
Do you think there would be any extreme social clashes if unification did happen between North Koreans and South Koreans?
Definitely.
So then how would you address that?
That's one of the major reasons that the South Korean population is not really willing to support unification. Because it's kind of obvious. If you have 20 million people flooding into the Republic of Korea, they're going to all want the same quality of life as South Koreans have. But the government's not going to be able to provide that for them instantly. So the most practical way of doing it, the more desirable model, would be to block any kind of massive inundation of North Korean refugees into South Korea, and to build up a lot of industrial complexes in North Korea to prop the nation up. But then we would have the problem of, if they're all citizens, then that's against equality, right? And that would become problematic. And many South Koreans worry because the government's simply not going to be able to provide 20 million people jobs. Not instantly, at least. And that's going to mean social instability. That's going to mean a dramatic increase in crime. And that's why a lot of people will want unification.
If there were to be any kind to be a war, if North Korea were to go, insane, which is actually probably quite reasonable, could South Korea, would U.S. involvement be required to the extent of what happened back in the early 1950s? And if it was just between North Korea and South Korea, could South Korea win?
South Korea could win. The thing is, there is no concept of winning and losing if you're fighting North Korea. You're going to be decimated. It's a given.
How come because their military so large?
No, it's because it's not going to be a war of attrition. It's going to be a war of pushing buttons, and in 5 or 6 days it's going to be over. Many people say that North Korea has nuclear weapons, and many people say that it's simply because they don't have the technology to launch it to the United States. And North Korea has enough weapons to decimate. And the thing is, with South Korea, everything's centered around Seoul, the nation's capital. So speaking in very realistic terms, if you were to bomb Seoul and get rid of Seoul, the South Korean economy would collapse, the South Korean system would collapse, and because that's the case, it's not going to be. And the South Korean military, it's large, as I told you, it's the sixth largest military in the world in terms of the number of people enlisted. But the North Koreans, they use a significant proportion of their GDP for their military expenses. So were there to be war, it's not going to be who can win, it's going to be both countries that can go down. And down, I mean as in the war. I think.
So do we know what the North Korean citizenry feels about unification, or posters not made it back alive?
First of all, you can't really ask about unification. Kim Jong-il's not going to allow that. That's number one. Kim Jong-il wants a red unification, which means communist unification. South Koreans aren't going to allow that. The thing is, what we see is that South Korean culture is pervading in North Korea right now more and more, thanks to pop culture, mostly. And they're growing an admiration for the South Korean way of life, or rather the Western way of life. And it's good in the sense that it's encouraging more people to be pro-South Korea, but it's bad in a way, because if we were to unify, not everyone is going to be able to live in a way that people in TV series, South Korean TV series are living. And the South Korean government simply isn't going to be able to provide that for them. Sarah?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the U.S. has always kept sort of a military presence around the borderline, around the border, in the 38th parallel, I think, to sort of give U.S. support for South Korea should anything happen. Where do you think U.S. interests should lie should a war break out between the North and the South?
Should a war break out? As a North Korean invasion?
Yeah.
Well, I think the U.S. is going to be forced to intervene because it has, first of all, a direct military presence, and it's going to be forced to intervene. And with treaties, it's forced to intervene. Should there be? I think there's a mutual defense treaty between the Republic of Korea and the United States, and the U.S. is going to be forced to intervene. But I think a better question, or rather a more relevant question, would be if the United States invades, what would happen? And I think it's not a smart way to do things. But it's fine. If the North Koreans invade, the United States has to intervene.
Okay, you kind of talked about how you were pro-unification. You talked about how you were pro-unification, but I just wanted to ask, like, regarding like the consequences in terms of like the South Korean way of life becoming much worse, and like the huge kind of influx of people creating like social instability. Would you consider that it's worth it and also kind of in a sense fair to the South Korean people that they would have? I mean, because maybe it's because you live in Korea that you have a feeling that you guys are like more like North and South Korea are more like one people, but I kind of view them as separate, and I don't think that there are any resemblance other than that they used to share a history. So like, I don't know, do you think, what do you think?
On a practical level, I want unification because in the long term it's going to be beneficial. If South Korea has a population of, 100 million, and it's going to be a self-sustainable economy, meaning that we won't have to rely on exports as much, and that's going to bring a lot more stability to our economy. And in the long term, if our major companies if they can survive, it's going to be better that way on a practical level. And on an emotional level, I think there's a lot of, I don't know, you just feel that it's right. And for a lot of Koreans, it works that way. And in a democracy, you have to follow the will of the people. I don't know. The will of the people, it's going to change.
If a war was to break out, and if the United States does intervene and that escalates to World War IV, do you really think that will be worth it?
Oh, you guys missed it?
It's sort of a joke to some people think they're not involved in Afghanistan. Canada as well between. So do you think it will be worth it for the U.S. to intervene if that will escalate to a world war with China and everyone else?
Okay. First of all, I'm South Korean, so I would have to say the U.S. should intervene. Because I want my country to exist. But the thing is, will there be World War IV? I don't know. The Chinese could easily intervene, of course. And if the Chinese and the Americans were to be engaged in a direct military conflict, I think we could call that another World War. But is that worth it? Well, you could discuss I don't know. I don't think the Chinese would really intervene. That's the United States. That depends on it's a very complex question. I can't really predict the future in many ways, but I'm South Korean.
I can't really predict the future.
Has to intervene.
One more question.
Okay.
In the Michigan 2's reading, there was a discussion of the younger South Korean population seeing America's presence in South Korea as sort of decreasing the possibility of unification. Do you have an opinion on that, or have you seen that sentiment?
It's a valid point, in a way, because the North Koreans argue that we are America's province. That the Republic's thing. That's what they say. That's what they argue. So it's part of their propaganda. But on a really realistic scale, on a really realistic level, I don't think so. Because if there's going to be unification, it's going to be centered. It's going to be with the South Korean government taking control of the North Koreans, and it doesn't really make much of a difference. If the U.S. were to say no, I guess, but unless that's the case, I don't think it would make much of a difference. And the thing is, U.S. military presence is allowing South Korea to cut down its defense budget a lot. So on a very practical level, South Koreans really need it, because otherwise we would have to spend billions and millions of more dollars to make sure that the same level of deterrence stays there. Because the U.S., it's not as necessary. The thing is, I think what people say is that you need 10 times or 7 times the military power of the military to make sure that the other side doesn't invade. And the thing is, if you were to maintain that, that's not a balance of power, but that's superiority, relative superiority. The South Koreans would have to invest a lot more. What are thoughts?